Good evening. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is Microsoft research and the way that we do research in ICT for development. So I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of Microsoft Research India as well as the group that I run, which is called Technology for Emerging Markets. And then I'll talk about a few of our sample projects in the context of our particular paradigm for doing research, which I talked about in the earlier panel. And then at the end, I'll wrap up with a few key lessons. Microsoft Research India was established about 4 years ago in 2005 in Bangalore, and the overall research lab is a computer science research lab. We do basic and applied research in all areas of computer science, and within the lab there's one group which is called Technology for Emerging Markets, and the mission of that group is ultimately to understand potential users of technology in poor communities around the world, and then design and innovate for them using technology but not necessarily restricted to technology, and then ultimately to collaborate with our partners in various different ways so that we can actually have larger scale impact. The group is very multidisciplinary. As I mentioned, the way that we do research involves ideas and research methodologies from multiple different fields. And so as a team, we're extremely multidisciplinary. As you can see from here, from this list, about half of the group has a background in the social sciences, including anthropology, sociology, economics, and so forth. And the other half has a more technological and hard science background. The interaction is very lively. Some of these different groups have very different ideas about what is considered what is considered good methodology, and sometimes what is considered good methodology in one field is terrible methodology in another field. So a lot of the group dynamic is in trying to reconcile these differences, but ultimately I think it makes for a much broader understanding of how we do our work. We are primarily based in Bangalore, which is that cluster of dots. And so most of our work is in and around Bangalore, but we want to make sure that our work has some generalizability. So to understand how other communities work in other countries, or even within India, we also do studies around the world, and in a few cases also do projects in other parts of the world as well. One aspect of formal research that's very important is to engage with the broader academic community. And in ICT for D, there was actually, despite a lot of interesting ICT for projects over the last several decades, as a research field, it's only really come together in the last few years. And we were actually one of the first to kind of fill the gap in terms of creating a conference where the emphasis is on rigorous, peer-reviewed research. And this is a conference that we co-founded with UC Berkeley, and it will be in its third year this year, held in Doha in April. And for those of you who are interested, I encourage you to register and to come if you can. So let me move on to our research methodology and a few of the projects that we do. Ultimately, as I mentioned in the panel, we think of our work as having three critical steps. The first one is immersion, in which we are doing everything we can to try to understand the community that is of interest to us, the community that we are ultimately hoping to impact. So if it's rural farmers, then we'll spend a lot of time with rural farmers, understand as much as we can about their life. Oftentimes we also have to pick a geography as well, and so it might be rural farmers in South India, for example. And the methodology that we most often use borrows heavily from the social sciences, particularly the qualitative social sciences. And these are ethnographic techniques, whether they're interviews, participant observation, where you watch people working in the particular area. In some cases, we will also even involve ourselves with the various different activities so that we understand better what it takes for people to just live their regular lives. And that immersion results in an intuition about that community that I think is very hard to gain otherwise. One thing I've discovered in speaking with groups in Redmond in the United States that are also interested in developing products for developing countries is that no matter how much I try to emphasize that it doesn't make sense to give every farmer in the world a $300 US PDA, their intuition is not there, and they don't really understand it at a deep level. And that's something that really only comes with time spent in the target community. Once that intuition is developed, it's much, much easier to do the design. In fact, I would say the design of both the technology as well as the overall system is often, if not easy, at least it becomes much easier when you really understand the community that you're working with. in our case, we think of design as not only being about the technology and not only about innovation in the technology, but also in the larger social institution in which that technology will be embedded. Very often we find that even with the ideal technology, there are social, political, and economic forces that are stacked against that technology working. And so in those cases, you also have to modify the institutional structure that you might be working within. And then finally, we go to evaluation. And this is a stage that we wait for until we have a pretty good idea that whatever our innovation is likely to be better than the alternatives. And once we are confident of that, then we perform what is called a randomized control trial, where the goal is to try to pick two separate groups, a control group and an experiment group. The control group does whatever it normally would do, or whatever we believe to be a baseline. And the experimental group is then, we implement whatever the intervention is. And in these cases, the idea is to establish a cause-result relationship where the impact of the actual intervention is in fact what is causing the final result. Now, one thing I'll mention is that all of these things, I keep saying that we, but it's not we as a lab, it's we in partnership with local, both communities as well as organizations. In fact, almost all of our projects are done usually in direct partnership with a local nonprofit organization. And those nonprofit organizations not only help us to engage with the community that we're interested in, but they also are very much involved in the process of both the understanding as well as the innovation. One thing that I think is hard to understand is that people who are in a particular environment are often not aware of the uniqueness of that environment because they are swimming in it. It's the same reason why we're not aware of the air around us most of the time. And so it helps to have somebody who has an outside perspective interact with people in that particular community so that you can understand the best how the differences are created. Finally, I have implementation, which is in parentheses, because as a research organization, we don't ultimately do large-scale implementation of any of our projects, but we try to work, again, through partners to scale out those projects that we are very confident of. So what I'm going to do is talk about this particular methodology in the context of 3 sample projects that we have been doing. This is a kind of broad sampling of the different research projects that we have. It's just a subset. And out of these, I'm just going to talk about these 3 in the middle. And this is a kind of grid that you can see how the different aspects of the research have materialized in the 3 different projects. And I'll go through each of these one by one. So the first one is a project that we were interested in, where we were interested in finding ways for technology to have an impact on microfinance. And if you're interested in development, I think you would know what microfinance is. But effectively, this is a system that was largely evangelized by Professor Yunus from Bangladesh, and which has now become a worldwide phenomenon. And the idea is to make very, very small loans to people in very poor communities so that they have a certain amount of income security and also so that they can potentially start enterprises of their own. We began our exploratory studies by just working with a number of microfinance institutions. And the goal was to really thoroughly understand the way that these organizations worked. In most cases, microfinance institutions are amazingly efficient at what they do. They make loans that are so small that commercial banks with all of their technology and power are not able to make a profit out of, and somehow these small microfinance institutions are able to do it at least and break even. So we started off by trying to understand everything in the flow of how they work. And one thing that really became obvious was that microfinance institutions are amazingly efficient. They use very low-cost labor to achieve things that, again, commercial banks can't do. And one thing about that is that it's not always the case that an expensive technology can make the process more efficient by adding the technology. So in the United States, if you give a bank teller a computer, you might add 10% to his or her productivity. And that will result, if, let's suppose the teller makes $22,000 a year, that will result in a $2,200 savings per year, which is more than the cost of the hardware. So that makes sense. In the context of, let's say, India, with microfinance, the problem is that the person who is acting as the teller is making such a small salary that even if you add something like a cell phone into the mix, it's not necessarily the case that a 10% increase in productivity will result in a net benefit by adding the technology. So this is just one example. These numbers are, very rough, typical cases. But it turns out that we found that this situation happens over and over and over. In fact, even though microfinance institutions complain themselves that they feel that their overhead costs are too high, the only reason why they say that is because